I'd like to welcome everybody to the 218th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is Benji Cohn with the Fish and Wildlife Division of the DNR. I'm joined today by Sascha, who you've been the terrestrial invasive species coordinator with the DNR since 2019, right? Not
Yep.
that. Um, so you coordinate all the invasive plant management for the state forest across Minnesota and also involved in the invasive species policy prevention and outreach. Sascha does hold a PhD in forest ecology from the University of Minnesota, where she studied buckthorn and other invasive plants. So quite the expert on buckthorn, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it today. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Benji, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Let's jump right in and get started. So I am sure that everyone has some familiarity with invasive species since you're joining us at this webinar, but I always like to start off talks like this with Minnesota's official definition, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So according to Minnesota statute, an invasive species means a non-native species, so a species not from here, that causes or may cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health, or threatens or may threaten natural resources or the use of natural resources in the state. So it's not that all species not from here are bad. It's that we are concerned about species not from our ecosystems that cause harm. So some invasive plants that threaten the natural resources in various parts of our state include things like common and glossy buckthorn, non-native bush honeysuckle, roundleaf bittersweet, common tansy, spotted knapweed, and there are many other invasive species present in Minnesota. A few dozen are listed on the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's noxious weed list, which Cassie shared in the chat, while others are not listed but can still cause harm in some places. So today I've been asked to focus on buckthorn, so I'll spend the majority of the rest of my time on that, but I am open to discussing other invasive plants as well during the Q&A at the end, if we have time for going into some of those. So what is buckthorn? There are two species of invasive buckthorn in Minnesota. There is common buckthorn, which is also called European buckthorn, and there's glossy buckthorn. Both of these species are shrubs or small trees that can reach 20 or maybe 25 feet tall. Both species were originally introduced from Europe as hedges because they make a great privacy screen between your house and your neighbors. The problem is that they also grow really densely like privacy hedges in the forest. But I'll talk a little bit more about the impacts of these species in a minute. But just to draw your attention to that photo on the screen, this is right alongside Rice Creek near my house, just north of St. Paul. And you can see it's early fall, the leaves have all fallen off the trees up in the canopy, and that wall of green growing in the understory is all buckthorn. So both of these species, common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn, are regulated as restricted noxious weeds in Minnesota. So you can learn more about that noxious weed list in that link that Cassie shared, but this means that both propagation, so growing and selling of these plants are prohibited. So although restricted noxious weeds are not required to be controlled or eradicated by law, landowners are strongly encouraged to manage these invasive plants on their properties in order to reduce the spread into new areas. So the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is the regulatory agency for invasive plants. And again, they cannot make people control buckthorn, as control of species on the restricted list is encouraged but voluntary. So why is buckthorn an issue? Why should we care about this? Both of these species can grow in very densely. They can outcompete and shade out other species. They make forests really difficult to walk through. They're difficult to see through, which can have impacts on recreation like hunting and bird watching. These species can limit the desirable tree regeneration and growth, so things like new tree seedlings can't establish underneath them and grow. Buckthorn can create super dense shade, so nothing grows underneath them, which can limit wildflower and other native understory plants. They also have a relationship with non-native earthworms who like to eat the leaves that fall on the ground. And this leads to the earthworms removing that leaf litter and that spongy duff layer that's supposed to be on our forest floor. And it just exposes the bare mineral soil, which happens to be really, really favorable to buckthorn seed germination and not favorable for germinating seeds from some of our native species like sugar maples. Additionally, buckthorn is the overwintering host of two agricultural pests, the soybean aphid and oat crown rust. So there's kind of a lot of different angles where buckthorn can impact our forests and our state more broadly. So some people in the Twin Cities metro area may think, what's the point in managing buckthorn? It is already all over the place. But really, it's not. While there are sites in parts of the state where buckthorn seems to be everywhere, and kind of is everywhere, there are still many places, especially in the northern half of the state, where there is not buckthorn or it's only found in isolated places. So this map was developed by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, where they modeled the expected distribution of common buckthorn across the state. So anywhere where you have the darker green is an area where there's more likely to be common buckthorn. And you can see that not everything in the state is dark green. There's actually a big portion of the northern part of the state that is not dark green. So that points to the idea that there is still value in managing buckthorn in certain regions of the state. And there's also value in managing certain sites, even if that site is in a region where buckthorn is really common. So managing it even in just a little forest stand can reduce some of the impacts I mentioned on the previous slide. And it can make sense with your goals for the future of that site. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two similar buckthorn species found in Minnesota. We have common buckthorn, which is also sometimes referred to as European buckthorn, and glossy buckthorn. Both of them grow as shrubs or small trees. And the main way to tell them apart is by their leaf differences. So common buckthorn has finely toothed leaf edges, and there are 3 to 5 curved veins on the leaf surface. These veins look kind of similar to dogwood leaves. Glossy buckthorn, on the other hand, has shinier leaves. They have smooth edges. They don't have any teeth. And there are 6 to 9 parallel veins on each of the leaves. The leaves of both of these species stay on the trees into the fall. They tend to stay on until we have a hard freeze. So even if we have frosts, they can tend to stick around for a little while after that. And this is much later than native trees and shrubs. So the fall is a great time to go looking for buckthorn, because when you go out in the woods and you see things in the understory that are green, they are very likely to be buckthorn. Glossy buckthorn tends to be found on wetter sites, while common buckthorn tends to be on upland or more dry sites. Glossy buckthorn can also actually grow in wetlands, so it can really handle the very wet sites. However, they can actually be found growing side by side. So glossy buckthorn can grow in those drier upland sites, and common buckthorn can grow in wetter areas as well. Both species are tolerant of growing in shaded forest understories, although they'll grow a lot faster when they get more sun. So that's why you often see them growing on the edges of forests and growing very robustly there. And they also are likely to grow faster if the canopy of a forest is opened up, say in a following a timber harvest, or some sort of disturbance like a blowdown. If you look at the bark of and the stems of buckthorn trees, if you cut into the stem, there is yellow orange underneath that bark. And many tips of common buckthorn twigs end in a thorn-like spine between dark buds. So that picture on the right, if you look at those buds, sometimes they're located kind of more askew like they are in that picture. Sometimes they're actually more opposite each other and lined up. And that kind of looks like a deer hoof or a buck's foot, hence the buckthorn name. Plants of these species can be either male or female, so that means that only some of the plants actually produce berries. So these purple to black berries on common buckthorn actually stay on the stems through the winter, so that's another good identifying characteristic in the winter. Birds are the primary spreaders of buckthorn seeds. They eat them. They are not very nutritious for birds, so they tend to run straight through them and then they poop them out somewhere else. Glossy buckthorn has also been sold by the nursery trade in a few different forms, so its appearance can actually vary. The cultivar Frangula ulmus columnaris is narrow and tall, and the cultivars Splendifolia and Ron Williams, pictured here, have narrow leaves that look very different, that give them a more fern-like texture. These are sold in other places as having non-viable seed, but all buckthorn cultivars are prohibited from sale in Minnesota. So while both common and glossy buckthorn are present in Minnesota, and both are quite prevalent in certain areas, both species behave pretty similarly and therefore can be managed using the same techniques. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be just referring to buckthorn broadly, and that these management techniques can be applied to common buckthorn or glossy buckthorn. So since we deal with these species so much, we actually have many tools in our toolbox, including both chemical and mechanical or non-chemical options. Which method we use depends on the size and density of the buckthorn, the size of the stand, your goals for the site, and what else is growing in the stand, among other factors. So initial management of buckthorn should really focus on reducing the total number of living stems within the site. And this can mean a number of different things. This can mean maybe prioritizing fruiting trees, the trees that have those fruits that have seeds in them, so that they stop dropping more seeds onto the site. This could also mean ensuring that you're adequately treating the stems, because stems that are damaged but not killed will resprout, replacing each damaged stem with many more new shoots. They tend to resprout like hydras and put up a lot of new shoots. So I'm going to briefly talk about each of the management option methods listed on this slide, and then I'll spend a bit of time talking about the importance of follow-up treatments, ongoing monitoring, and the concept of reseeding or planting after buckthorn removal. So first off, cut stump herbicide application is my preferred method for anyone who has a relatively small area or scattered stems and who wants to treat the stems once and not have to deal with them again. So the general process is to cut down the buckthorn stems a couple inches off the ground, and then immediately, or at least within 2 hours, but sooner the better, apply a triclopyr-based herbicide to the freshly cut stump. So to cut the stem, you can use a handsaw or a brush saw, which is what is being used in the right photo. Or you can use a chainsaw if you have large enough trees. Most of the DNR staff who use this method on isolated buckthorn stems that they find in the woods just carry a folding handsaw around with them to cut the stems. In the left photo, you see a tube that looks like a bingo dauber. It's called a buckthorn blaster, and you can purchase these from the North American Invasive Species Management Association online. I think Cassie just shared the link. And then I recently actually came across another product called Daubit that is actually available on Amazon. I haven't tried that one yet, but it claims to hold up to solvent-based products, including herbicides. So I think both links have been shared if you want to look into those. People often ask, what should they do with the cut stems? So say you've cut down a bunch of them, what do you do with those? Ideally, you would just leave them on site to decompose. So there are already seeds that are at your site. So it's best to just leave any additional seeds that are on those stems that you just cut down, leave those on the site too, instead of moving them to a new place and risking spreading the species further. If you can't leave the stems on site due to space or aesthetics or other reasons, you can look into whether your city or county has local yard waste pickup or yard waste disposal site. You can also chip the stems on site. Just be cautious about where you distribute those wood chips, since there will still be seeds present there. If you have a much denser stand, and maybe you have sapling size plants, say those less than 3 inches in diameter, where cutting and painting every stump would be impossible. Basal bark herbicide treatment could be an option. So the general idea with this one is to use a backpack herbicide sprayer or a handheld garden type sprayer and apply triclopyr around the bottom 12 to 18 inches of the stem. This method will likely have more overspray than the bingo dauber method, so it makes sense more in areas where you don't have much in the way of desirable vegetation, the plants you actually like in the understory, which really dense sapling stands of buckthorn tend not to have much else growing in them because they shade everything below them out. Cut stump and basal bark treatments can both be done throughout much of the year. So if you're using an oil-based herbicide, you can actually apply that even when temperatures are below freezing, as long as there's not enough snow on the ground to prevent you from reaching the base of the stems to fully treat that bottom 12 to 18 inches of stem. I generally recommend against doing cut stump or basal bark treatments in the spring when the buckthorn is still leafing out, because at that time, all the water and nutrients in the plants are moving up, limiting how much chemical would actually be sucked down into the root to actually kill the plants. Fall is an ideal time for these methods because you can easily see which stems are buckthorn since they keep their leaves later, and they're typically the plants are taking nutrients back down into their roots to store through the winter at that time, so they're more likely to take in more of that herbicide. Summer is good too, although drought-stressed plants don't move herbicide around as well, so just be aware if you're in a drought. Finally, hot temperatures can also cause some herbicides to volatilize and go up into the air, which can increase other plants getting damaged by them. So make sure you read the labels and be aware of the weather when you're applying herbicide. Small plants, those that are only maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, because you never want to spray herbicide over your head, so just the shorter plants, can be effectively treated by spraying herbicide onto the leaves. So this is called a foliar herbicide application. This method can be a good choice if you have lots of dense, evenly sized buckthorn, again, without much desirable growing underneath, since you will definitely have overspray and potential for impacting non-target plants. You can mitigate some of that impact by doing this spraying in early fall once many of our native species have already gone dormant for the winter. So when just buckthorn and maybe a few other things are still actively growing. This method can also be used effectively when you're following up on a previous cut stump treatment. So if some of your stumps resprout, perhaps because they were missed with the herbicide in the initial treatment, you can more easily spray the leaves of the smaller resprouting plants. Like in this right-hand photo, you can see where that stem was cut and then it has resprouted. But this smaller little shrub of buckthorn could be effectively sprayed with the leaves, the foliar spray. So what herbicide to use? The active ingredient triclopyr is most effective on buckthorn. For cut stump or basal bark application where you want a high concentration of triclopyr, say in the 18 to 25% range, Pathfinder 2 is a great product to use because it's pre-mixed. It's ready to use. So it's safer because it doesn't require you to mix chemicals and risk spills. For foliar application, when you're spraying it on the leaves, you want to use a much lower concentration, something in maybe the 3 to 5% range. So you would need to either purchase a different premixed herbicide product or mix something like Garlon 4 with water to the desired concentration. If you're mixing your own Garlon 4 or a similar triclopyr product, you'll also want to consider adding a small amount, maybe a quarter to a half a percent of methylated seed oil as a surfactant. This increases how much herbicide gets penetrated into the leaf through that waxy leaf surface and can make the treatment more effective. So the link that Cassie shared in the chat takes you to a table with some herbicide recommendations for buckthorn. You can also use products with the active ingredient glyphosate. Sometimes these are easier to find than triclopyr, but triclopyr generally has been found to work better on buckthorn. You can find some triclopyr-based products at your local hardware store. Sometimes these are sold as brush killer or poison ivy killer, Or you can find Pathfinder 2 and Garlon and those similar types of products at more of an agricultural supply store. Finally, whenever you use pesticides or herbicides, always read the full label and follow all instructions. The label is the law. I'm going to just say that one more time because it is that important. Whenever you use pesticides, always read the label, follow the label. That's for your own safety as well as the safety of our environment around us. So now there are also plenty of buckthorn management options that don't involve using herbicides. So I'll talk about a few of those next. Goats are adorable, first off, and they're also excellent ambassadors for increasing awareness about invasive species and other natural resource issues. Research is still lacking on whether and how goats can be used most effectively, although generally speaking, they may be effective when combined with other methods of control in some settings. Goats can eat small stems of buckthorn, so they can eat off the leaves, and although they will resprout, and they can girdle or strip the bark off of some larger stems. But it's worth noting that they also can girdle our native desired trees that you want to stay there and not get killed. Goats also trample buckthorn seedlings, which can kill them. However, they do eat everything, both invasive and native alike, so that can be an issue for trying to get desirable plants onto your site. Repeated grazing over multiple years may be necessary to reduce the number of small buckthorn stems, or goats can be used as an initial treatment to knock back the woody vegetation in an area to improve access so that you can actually follow up with another buckthorn management technique. Goats are able to access steeper terrain than machines or people can access, so sometimes they can be a useful tool in those types of situations. So overall, goats are really good at outreach and can sometimes be a useful tool especially when combined with other methods. But unfortunately, they're not great for all situations because wouldn't we all just prefer to have goats out there looking cute and doing good work for us? So a tool in some situations. Forestry mowing is another tool that's most useful on large stands, those with access for heavy machinery. So these photos are of a DNR forester driving a skid steer with a drum mulching head on a 20-acre stand near Detroit Lakes. So in the right photo, the right side of this trail was treated using this skid steer, and the left side of the trail he hadn't gotten to yet. And so that's what it used to look like with really dense buckthorn. The buckthorn had been very thick, and it would have been very expensive to hire a contractor to go in by hand to basal bark or cut stump treat the whole stand. So we mowed it all down. However, many of those stems that were mowed down will resprout. Some of them where the mulcher damaged the area where the roots meet the stem or that root crown. If damage happened there, then the whole stem may have been killed, but others will definitely resprout. So this treatment is not a standalone treatment. We plan to do some foliar herbicide spraying this summer of the resprouts since they'll all be small. They'll be maybe a foot or two tall, and they'll all be about the same size. And there's easy access because we got this machine in, so it should be easy to get in there and do some foliar spraying there as a follow-up. A method that doesn't use herbicides and does kill the plants is pulling them out of the ground. So this is easier to do on small stems and when the ground is slightly moist. Tools like the weed wrench or uprooter, which are shown in this left-hand picture, can help use leverage to pull out larger stems than you could just pull out by yourself, like the kids are trying to do on the right-hand picture. I think Cassie shared a link to examples of these tools in the chat. You can often borrow these tools from either your local DNR forestry office or from your local soil and water conservation district, and some cities and towns also have some for lending as well. This method can be a really fun one for getting kids or volunteers involved. One thing to note about this method is that it disturbs the soil a lot, which can make for really great conditions for buckthorn seeds to germinate and grow, or for other weedy invasive plants to come in. So if you're doing hand pulling, weed wrenching, follow-up monitoring, or planting of native plants is really recommended. A method that can be good for homeowners who don't have a ton of buckthorn stems is the bagging or covering of cut stumps. So in this method, cut the stem a few inches above the ground and then cover it with heavy black plastic bag, and you can secure it on really tightly with a zip tie. The goal of this method is to prevent any light at all from reaching any of the remaining stem or roots. So if there's any light that peeks in through the bottom of that bag, you're going to get resprouts. But if you can keep it dark, then after a couple years, the bags can be removed and the plant will be dead. There's a company that sells these bags. The link of that example is in the chat, or some people have actually used tin cans that they nail on top of stems. It can be a labor-intensive uh, treatment method to attach all these covers on, and it looks pretty funny in the woods for a couple of years. And yeah, it really can take that long for those stems to actually die. Critical period cutting is a new method of buckthorn control that research is still being done on. So the Friends of the Mississippi River, which is a nonprofit group out of the Twin Cities, is leading on piloting this method. And they're doing this in places where they can't or don't want to use herbicides and where they have a lot of volunteer labor. So the basic premise is that you actually cut the stem 3 to 4 feet off the ground. Most of these other methods have been just a few inches off the ground. This one is cut around waist height. And then 2 times per year, once in the spring and once in the fall, someone goes back out to that stem and strips off any leaves and branches that sprout from it. So interestingly, when you cut the stem that high, the resprouts come out at the top and not at ground level. And when these leaves and stems are removed in both the spring and fall for 2 years in a row, uh, it seems to drain the plant's resources more effectively and kill the stems so that they can just be pushed over dead after a couple of years. So you can read more about this method at the link from Friends of the Mississippi River. They are currently working with the University of Minnesota researchers to study this method so that we can better understand the physiology of buckthorn's response to this treatment. Why does it seem to be working? And they're also trying to better document the impacts to show whether this really is a successful method that should be expanded into more places. I've referenced this in passing throughout this talk, talking about all these different methods, but it's really important to be aware that buckthorn management is not a one-time event. Repeated treatments are necessary to get the stems that were missed, or repeated methods might actually be part of the plan. For example, I mentioned the forestry mowing project where we used machinery to mulch a bunch of buckthorn, so that's that top right photo. And then we plan to go back in and spray herbicide on the leaves of the resprouting stems, which you can see in a carpet in that larger photo. So that larger photo was taken in June this year. So you can see all the stems that were sprouted. Pretty much everything green in there that you see is buckthorn. Or if you're doing weed wrenches to pull out stems, you'll need to go back to monitor to see what fills in that space and what grows in that disturbed soil. It's likely you'll get a flush of tiny buckthorn. Most buckthorn seeds germinate or sprout within 2 years, but more can also be brought in from neighboring areas by birds. So overall, ongoing monitoring is really necessary to make sure your efforts don't go to waste due to reinvasion. Another thing I want to mention is that taking on buckthorn can feel overwhelming. If you're doing it yourself, it's important to not bite off more than you can chew. So there are a few tactics people sometimes take when they can't treat all their buckthorn at once. Some people start by removing all the fruiting buckthorn stems and ignoring all the rest. This is a way to decrease the amount of seeds entering your site and to therefore decrease the amount of baby buckthorn that will sprout. However, the juvenile or teenage buckthorn sapling stems will continue to grow, and some of those over time will mature into female trees that will begin producing fruits and seeds. So you'll need to keep working at this over time. Another option is to start at the edges of your invaded area. So treat the isolated clumps on the outskirts first, and then over time, work your way in, treating sections at a time, and work your way into the densest parts of the infestation. This can help you feel like you're making progress, and it also makes more sense than starting at the densest area, which is most likely to be reinvaded if you don't stay on top of your treatments. One thing that can be done to keep buckthorn from reinvading after you've taken it out is replanting native grasses and flowers. There's some really interesting research coming out of the Cover It Up project at the University of Minnesota. So they have been studying how if you can make a bunch of shade in an area where you know that there's a bunch of buckthorn seeds, the seedlings that sprout won't survive. So how do you make a bunch of shade? Well, after you remove the buckthorn using whatever method you want, you can plant seeds or plants of grasses, wildflowers, or shrubs. And if you want some idea of what to plant, check out the link in the chat. I especially want to highlight the idea of planting grasses like Virginia wild rye, which is what one of our foresters is planting in that left or right photo. Because if you're planning to do follow-up spot herbicide treatment using triclopyr, so if you're planning to follow up and treat any of the resprouting buckthorn that might pop back up after your initial treatment, triclopyr will kill herbaceous plants, so things like wildflowers, but it won't injure grasses. So if you wanted to plant grasses, that could be a way to get some of that shade and still be able to use herbicides as a treatment. Grasses are really great if you have a somewhat open tree canopy. They prefer more sun over shade. So if you can see at least 10% of the sky when you look up, then that can be a good spot to put grasses. Wildflowers can handle more shade, but they do take a little longer to establish. So when should you plant? Well, since most of the buckthorn seed in the soil will germinate or sprout 1 to 2 years um, after it lands on the ground, it's best to get the seeds planted in the season after the seed-bearing buckthorn plants were removed. So that might mean seeding in winter or planting in early spring. Overall, it's really important to think about your whole plan for managing buckthorn. So think about what you're going to do next year when you're deciding what to do this year. So if you're planning to spray in the future, you might want to plant grasses and not plant other plants that might be damaged by herbicide. So now you know about some of the options for managing buckthorn, but what resources are out there to help you? Cassie is going to be sharing a flurry of links in the chat from this slide. So the DNR Forest Stewardship Cost Share Program provides financial assistance to private landowners to help accomplish a variety of forestry-related practices. It's open to woodland owners in Minnesota who work closely with a DNR cooperative forest management forester who approves eligible activities. This can include buckthorn management. There's also a similar federal cost share program through the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, but it can take longer than the state version to get funds to landowners to get that off the ground. So our DNR Cooperative Forest Management Foresters can help get you on track for both programs where appropriate. On the link to this map in the chat, you can click on your county and find the contact info for the forester in your area. And you can reach out to them to see what opportunities might be available in your area or for your particular property. Other local organizations can also sometimes have grant funding, expertise, or labor to assist landowners. So you can see if there's a cooperative weed management area or cooperative invasive species management area, CWMA or SISMA, in your area at the Board of Water and Soil Resources website in the chat. Soil and water conservation districts are great places to get assistance on figuring out what to plant after you've removed buckthorn. Folks there usually have good local expertise on what grows well in certain areas. And county agricultural inspectors have expertise related to disposal options for their given county. Finally, buckthorn removal tools like weed wrenches and loppers can be borrowed from DNR forestry offices. There's a lot of amazing public lands in Minnesota, as well as private, and there's a lot of buckthorn in many of our public lands. If you're interested in helping to manage buckthorn, keep an eye out for habitat management events on the DNR's volunteer website or at your local parks or nature centers. It can be a fun way to spend a Saturday and get some exercise. If you want to learn more about invasive plants in Minnesota, here are a few of my favorite resources. So the Minnesota Department of Transportation's Noxious Weed Guide is an excellent field guide to all of the invasive plants that are regulated in Minnesota. So the link in the chat takes you to a free PDF of the guide, and this QR code on the screen directly downloads the guide onto your device. It has really great photos, including of lookalike species, as well as management information. The next link in the chat is to the DNR's invasive plant web pages. These include pages for all the regulated invasive plants, as well as pages for other invasive plants that aren't currently regulated. Again, these include lots of photos, information on how to ID the species, impacts of the species, lookalikes, species you could plant instead of whatever problematic species you're looking at, as well as management recommendations. The final link there is to the woody invasives of the Great Lakes website, and that link is directly to their website on management. So this is a great resource for getting more details on many of the management techniques that I talked about today, because there's only so much you can cram into a 35-minute webinar. So it's nice to get some more information in writing on some of these. As you've heard, there's no silver bullet for buckthorn management, but there are a lot of options that can make sense in different places or in different situations. And the management technique you choose may change over time as you continue to manage and monitor a population. So the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes website is a great resource for learning more details and specifics about some of these different management options. Finally, while buckthorn is obviously a big deal on the Minnesota landscape, there are other invasive plants and insects out there, and so it's up to all of us to prevent things from becoming the next buckthorn. Prevention is cheaper than management, so preventing the introduction and spread of invasive species is way better than trying to figure out how to manage them once they're established. So some things that you can do to help prevent the spread of invasive species include removing plants, animals, and mud from boots, gear, pets, and vehicles, cleaning your gear before entering and leaving recreation sites. So while buckthorn is primarily spread by birds, many of our other invasive plants are spread primarily by people, and often small seeds are carried in mud that is on boots or on gear, and that can easily be spread from place to place. So cleaning your gear before you go to a new place is a really good practice to do. Additionally, it's helpful to stay on designated roads and trails because when you drive or walk off trails, you're much more likely to encounter populations of invasive plants and pick up some of those seeds that you can spread to a new place. Finally, using certified or local firewood and hay can reduce the spread of insects that can be carried in firewood or seeds that can be carried in hay. And if you want to get your very own handheld boot brush, like my colleague Mike is using in that photo to clean the mud off of his boots, you can come visit the DNR building at the State Fair next month. We'll be handing out free boot brushes at the invasive species booth inside the DNR building. So with that, we should hopefully have plenty of time for some questions. And here is my contact information. So feel free to drop me a line if you have specific questions that we don't get to, or if you ever want to chat buckthorn sometime.
Lots of hands clapping. Thank you so much, Sascha, for sharing all that information. I know buckthorn has been literally a thorn in my side a few times while been out fishing and doing some habitat work with Trout Unlimited around here and there. So it's good to get some good information, and it's a constant problem for people not only in their neighborhood but any land management stuff. So appreciate your sharing this with us. So lots of questions coming in. So I think we'll start right off. I'm not for sure on this one. Craig asked about the product preen, if that would prevent buckthorn from regerminating once an area's been opened by removing existing buckthorn.
I don't know specifically about that product. There are, I'm just kind of guessing on this one, there are some herbicide products that are called pre-emergent herbicides that can actually suppress the germination of seeds. And so there are some products you can put down after you've removed, say, buckthorn or another species to keep seeds from germinating. Whether you choose to use something like that also depends on what your plan is for that site, because it won't just keep buckthorn from germinating, it would also keep other plants from germinating. So you still have a lack of plants there. Nature abhors a vacuum. Something's got to come in. And so being able to fill in space with desirable plants that could shade out that buckthorn may be a better choice in certain circumstances, but there are some pre-emergent herbicides out there.
Great. You can stop your presentation if you want. I think
Oh,
people got your
sorry, thank you.
email address down. Wade was asking, can I cut down buckthorn growing in a wildlife management area bordering my property? So do you want to answer that? You want me to take a stab at it?
I will just say you should only ever manage plants on your own property. You can reach out to the land manager at the wildlife management area and talk to them about your concerns, and perhaps you guys could coordinate on managing it together. I know that we have areas where state forest land abuts private landowners. Our foresters will reach out to that private landowner and say, hey, we're planning to manage this buckthorn. Are you interested in looking into a cost share program and potentially doing management at the same time so we can manage at the landscape level? But yeah, you should never manage something on someone else's property. That would be trespassing.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. It'd be trespassing. We have a great volunteer program at the DNR. That's a great way to sign up to be a volunteer, work with the manager of that WMA, and talk to them and make sure you're signed up as a volunteer and talk to them about what you want to do, and they can recommend and maybe put you to work and help out with that. So that'd be great.
And yeah, can I just add one more thing too?
Yeah.
We have DNR volunteers who have been trained to use buckthorn blasters. So that is an option that if that made sense for that wildlife management area and the supervisor there wanted to take you on as a volunteer and train you up for that, it could be a great use of time and skills.
It's a great way to learn. Like you said, learn and be certified to the blaster and learn how to use the tools and stuff. So sign up to be a volunteer and remove buckthorn on somebody else's property, learn how to do it before you go back and do it on your own. We can promote that all we want, right? Volunteering is great. So we have a few questions on the glyphosate. Greg said it's not available in stores anymore, and Bill was wondering if it would work on stumps.
Yeah, so glyphosate, there's been some changes in regulation of certain herbicides, and so some companies are no longer selling that to the public. Triclopyr is better for buckthorn anyway. You can use glyphosate on stumps to answer the other question. Again, you'd want to do it at the higher percentage. That link that we shared in the chat to the DNR table on herbicides lays out some percentages, and glyphosate is included in there, I believe. So it can be used for that. And yeah, there's always read the labels on pesticides. What is on the shelf it varies in different places, and what you can get at your local hardware store. Oftentimes they put multiple different chemicals in there, and they wouldn't necessarily be what I recommend. So if you have the option, going to more of an agricultural supply store, and if you have a large enough area that it makes sense to buy a quantity of herbicide, they have more expertise in this type of these types of products and can provide you more specific products that might fit your needs.
Great. Nellie says hi. So hi, Nellie. Looking for places where she can rent a weed puller about the list. So Nellie, go up in the chat and look under, I think it was, well, one was the DNR forestry locations.
That's where I would go. That we have a map online, one of those links to the cooperative forest management foresters. And if you reach out to those forestry offices, find the one that's nearby, and they can connect you with tools to rent.
Great. Craig wanted to point out also that another great source of help is the U of M Master Naturalist program. They're looking for volunteer hours. So if you have a bigger project and need some volunteers, that might be a good resource for you.
It's a great one.
I think you shared a link on this too. Emily asked about knowing the cost share or grant opportunities for establishing a goat herd for buckthorn removal. Not for sure specifically in the goat herd part, but
I am not aware of that. You might look more from an agricultural angle on that. I'm not really sure.
let's see, Craig, when planting post buckthorn removal, do you need to remove some of the leaf litter to have a successful growth? of seeded species?
Um, no is probably the short answer. So if you're in an area with a lot of buckthorn, you tend not to have a ton of leaf litter. Buckthorn leaves decompose very quickly, and there are often earthworms, non-invasive earthworms present in that area as well, which increase the speed at which those buckthorn leaves, as well as other species leaves, decompose. And so there's usually enough variability in what's on the ground that seeds can do their thing. I think there's arguments for putting down if you're doing grass seeding and stuff in the winter, because I think the freezing, thawing, and melting can help work that into soil better. But you don't need to necessarily clear areas. You might want to think about it if you've like mowed using a like the skid steer with our mulching head in certain areas puts down a decent amount of mulch. And so you might need to think about it there.
Emily was asking if you have buckthorn stand that was cut down and you didn't act quickly enough to kill the stumps, do you need to recut before applying buckthorn blaster?
Yes, the buckthorn blaster will only work on freshly cut stumps. The fresher, the better. If it's been more than 2 hours, those stumps are going to sort of seal over like a wound. They're going to close up. And so it doesn't matter what chemical you put on top, they're not going to soak in very well.
Good to know. Fran, yes, our webinars are all recorded. You can visit us at mndnr.gov/discover and find those recordings. I will try to get that posted up here probably Monday or Tuesday after we get the closed captioning done for that. So I was asking about forestry mowing options. How often would you need to remow? And how does the machine mow? They're trying to use a critical cut in a local park.
I think those are two different questions. So mowing or mulching would actually be cutting down buckthorn down to ground level, like with it's a big spinning drum that just chews everything up. It's kind of intense. And there's still ongoing research on different options for how frequently you mow. So one option is to mow an area and then go in and follow up with foliar spray. So spraying herbicide on the resprouts. Another option, if you don't want to spray, you could mow and then let things resprout and mow again. And that theoretically over time will decrease some of the energy stores available in that buckthorn, and you can be killing some more of those stems. You'll have to keep in mind that that's also going to be mowing down other stuff that's growing there. So it's sort of the balance of what's your goal here? What are you trying to end up with? But there are folks who are trying to do multiple cycles of mowing to see if that can really knock back the buckthorn. And they found some success where you mow and then you wait a couple of years, and that lets the seed bank germinate as well. So you're getting more of those smaller seeds, and then you go back in and mow again 2 or 3 years later and take out the resprouts and take out the new germinants. Um, the critical period cutting is a little different because that one is more focused on it's actually cutting the stems at a higher height, not at ground level, so that they resprout up at waist height, and then repeatedly going in and hand stripping off the leaves that sprout in the spring and again in the fall to really reduce the amount of energy stores in that plant. So that's a much quieter practice than doing the forestry mower, but does take more labor. I mean, someone will be physically touching that stem at least 4 times, which is a lot different than going in with herbicide and doing it once or touching it once or, taking in machinery and having a bigger footprint.
Yeah. Uh, Becky was wondering if you give her suggestions on what the best replacement plant is for along the edge of a wetland. Good replacement plant. I know you had a couple links in there for seeds, but
Yeah, I am not going to give you a good answer right off the top of my head. I know that on the DNR's Buckthorn website, we do have alternative native substitutes, basically. So native plants that would fit a lot of the different characteristics that our invasive plants have that we like about them. And so we tend to try to pick species that kind of match up with those. Off the top of my head, I am not going to come up with a good one for a
There's
western
some kind
plant.
of willow or dogwood probably, but
Those
website
sound
would
good
be a
to
good
me. Yeah.
option.
Yeah, those sound good.
So, Harrison brought up a good point. He works at a water treatment plant. Are any of the products safe to use if they may enter treated water source? And using products, especially herbicides and stuff around water is you be super careful with it and
Hmm.
lots of
Yes.
restrictions. So
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's anytime you use herbicides near water, whether it's a drinking water source or just natural stream, you need to be, if you're applying adjacent to water, you need to be using a product that is uh, labeled for aquatic use. And so there are some formulations of triclopyr that are labeled for aquatic use. So you might want to be looking at Vastlan or Garlon 3A as opposed to Garlon 4. Additionally, whenever DNR is applying herbicides, we have a very rigorous process for assessing whether there are drinking water supplies in the area and different things we have to check before we are permitted to use herbicides. So this goes back to the always read the label, always follow the label anytime you're using herbicides.
good to know. Lisa has a question. This gets back into the trespassing, so at least we're not going to answer that. But at any time, like we've talked about this in foraging webinars and other things, in public space, um, don't just feel like you can go out there and do what you want to do. Make sure you check with the property owner, the city, the village, whatever, whoever owns that property or manages that property. I'm sure they would love to have you come out and pick some buckthorn, but again, check with them first to make sure you're doing that appropriately and fitting into their management plans. So,
Yeah, that's because kind of as we talked about a little bit today, different methods lend themselves to different follow-up methods. And
yep.
so even though you're like, well, nobody wants buckthorn, so can't I just go deal with it? We see where you're coming from, but we want to know how that act of managing fits into the broader management
Yep.
plan for that area.
And once you get liability and lawyers involved, there's
We don't
lots of
want that.
questions. So
We don't
just
want lawyers involved.
talk to the appropriate people. I'm sure they'd love to have the help and they make sure you do it in the appropriate way. So Laura, kind of the same, any suggestion on how to find land manager? I'm not for sure exactly what land manager you're looking for, city or whatever, forestry side, look on our website. There's a link in there to find the property or the area managers for like WMAs or aquatic management areas, any of that stuff. So we can help you out with that. Look through the website or send us an email too if you want. So Susan asked, are you aware of any communities in Minnesota that have tried to mandate buckthorn control via local ordinance?
I've heard of some communities talking about doing that. I'm not aware of any that have actually implemented something. If anyone knows of it, I would love to hear about it, just out of curiosity, but I'm not aware of any that have actually implemented that. I mean, the hard thing is in certain areas, it's really widespread. And so mandating doing something about it requires having funds to help people do that. And there are a lot of different things that funds could go towards, be it different invasive species or different other things. And so it's sort of a where are you going to fight those battles?
Yep. Bonnie and Martin had both similar questions here. One, at what point are the green berries viable if I cut them down in the summer? And then Martin was asking how long are the seeds viable on the ground?
Yeah, good questions. Um, Seeds are viable for only 1 to 2 years. So there's a recent study done by the University of Minnesota that came out just a couple of years ago that kind of changed our understanding of buckthorn. It had been commonly understood that seeds lasted 7 years in the soil. Turns out that was just a number that kind of came up and had been quoted by everybody for years, but wasn't actually supported by research. And so folks at the University of Minnesota actually did a pretty rigorous study and found that over 90% of the seeds that were put out on the ground germinated the next year. And then the remaining, almost all the remaining ones germinated the following year. So the majority of your seeds are going to germinate right away the next year and the rest soon after. In terms of when a seed becomes viable, I don't know exactly when it would be in the development of those fruits, but also anywhere where you have a fruit bearing tree, there are already seeds on the ground. So it's one of those things that like might not matter that much. And that's where we go back to, if you're going to cut it down, it's best to just leave it where it was, because we know that there's already seeds in that area. So whether those seeds have fully developed yet or not, you'll still be putting them in an area where you already know there already are seeds. So it's not spreading it, keeping it in an area that you're already planning to follow up on next year anyway.
Kind of leads you into the next question here. We didn't talk about it yet, but prescribed fire. One of the things cleaning up buckthorn that I've done in the past, we've made a big pile in the middle of winter. We burn the pile down. Would prescribed burning be an option for thick stands, or I know they need follow-up. Do you want to talk about that at all? Or
Yeah, sure. So prescribed fire is definitely a tool that could be used for buckthorn in certain places. One of the issues with fire in buckthorn is that in order to have a prescribed fire, you need to have fuels. So you need to have something to light and to carry through a stand. If you're in a stand of dense buckthorn, there is almost nothing on the forest floor. Those buckthorn leaves decompose too quickly. It's too shaded for grasses and understory plants to grow. There's nothing to burn, so there's nothing to carry a fire. So that can be a limiting factor if you're trying to do this in like forested systems. However, flip side of that is that prescribed fire can be a really good tool for managing buckthorn if you're in more of an open savanna type system where you do have grasses growing, so you have fuels that can carry a fire. They can top kill buckthorn, they can knock it back. If you're planning to do regular fires, every few years, that can be a great way to knock back the buckthorn that might be encroaching into your open areas. So fire can definitely be a tool. It just has somewhat limited application in more forested systems.
great. Now we might have time for one quick more. Somebody's looking for trees that look like buckthorn, and how do you tell the difference? You had a great slide at the beginning, kind of described that a little bit. So, any other
Yeah, I mean,
tips?
buckthorn can be confused with like some black cherries and dogwoods. I would really encourage folks to take a close look at the leaves. Like the leaves are actually very distinctive. If you kind of spend some time with them, look at them, look at those pictures, look at the veins. They really are kind of distinctive veins, and that's definitely a good way to take a look. The other thing to do is in the fall, notice which shrubs stay green. If it's on your own property, put a flag around a few of them. So you can say, okay, I know for sure this right now that this is buckthorn. And then you can watch it through the year and see in the spring, how does it look? See how it looks in different times of year.
Great suggestions. We are fastly approaching 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We had a great audience today. And Sascha, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and passion about buckthorn and all the good ways to get rid of it, I guess. So hope everybody can join us next week for 219. We're talking about walleye genetics in Minnesota, which has been a really cool topic. A lot of cool work being done on walleye in the state. So hopefully you can join us in Craig Super next week, and we'll talk about walleye. So everybody get outside, stay safe, and enjoy a couple warm summer days in Minnesota. We'll talk to you soon.